Oh, good.
The link to the source sheet should be in the chat.
Yep.
And we are in Sefer Shemot, the second book of the Chumash.
Yes.
Yay!
And we are going to talk tonight about the name of that book. We take for given that it's Sefer Shemot. Of course, what's the English of Sefer Shemot?
Exodus.
Exodus.
Yeah, it's a trick question because how do you translate Sefer Shemot?
Well, Exodus is what it's about, but Shemot is just the first word in the
Okay, so maybe. What does the word Shemot mean?
Name.
Names. So why is it not called the Book of Names?
Oh, but because the people who translated into Greek had a different idea.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the name of the book and whether we think the name that we've adopted is the appropriate name for it. Of course, why, right? It should be fairly obvious. Why was the name Exodus chosen?
That's what it's about.
That's it.
That's what it's about.
The event.
I think duko means to be led out, actually, I think, not just to go out, as I recall, but anyway, to go out from.
Well, what word was that?
Means to go out from.
Yeah, the word exit comes from the same root.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I don't know any Latin, any Greek, and any of that stuff. It's from Greek or from Latin?
Latin.
From Latin.
I think the root is duko, dokari, dokavi, that kind of thing. And I think
Duko.
it means to be let out, to lead out, actually. It's I think, but I gotta check that. Oh my gosh.
Okay.
Anyway,
I'll trust you. I have no
to
idea.
go out.
Okay. So before we get into any of our sources, let's just think for a moment. Is the book, right, Sefer Shemot? I think it's at least 35 to 40 chapters. Are all 40 chapters about the Exodus?
No.
No.
It's mainly about building the Mishkan.
Okay, so the Exodus ends, let's call it somewhere around chapter 15 with the Song of the Sea. So we've got more than half the book that's not about the Exodus. What are other key events or key themes that take place in this book? Gary, you mentioned the Mishkan. There's something before the Mishkan that's pretty important.
Matan Torah.
Yeah, the giving of the Torah. Right? Shouldn't that be the seminal events? If we're going to identify one key moment, one key event from this book, why is it not the book of the giving of the Torah?
But the thing is, not even arguing with Jews. The Vulgate was not made by us.
Okay, so part of it gets into the history of the translations and who was translating, and there's an interesting history. Again, I don't know details. I just know there's an issue about as far as breaks in the chapters, whether those chapter breaks are authentic or an original to Judaism, or whether those come from other sources, and the naming also, right? So if Exodus comes from the Septuagint or from some other translation, the Vulgate, someone else, so maybe it's we shouldn't be asking the question because maybe we should just reject Exodus as a name for this book. So I'm not sure. So let's see what some of the sources on this have to say.
The question still stands because how does a book of names relate to things like the Egel HaZahav and there's another really big thing that happens?
Okay, right. So there's a general question, and we'll see. Let's get into some of the sources, then we'll come back to this about where the names of our Sifrei Chumash come from.
Also, the book, I mean, you can argue that the Exodus is what sets the whole book in motion.
Okay, okay.
Sure.
Most definitely.
Good.
So let's
Mhm.
start with the Dot Mikra. The Dot Mikra is a source that we quote often. It's a contemporary commentary from Israel. Really interesting combination of traditional and academic sources. It was, I believe, someone involved with Yediot Achronot, I believe, was involved in putting the project together, which was Yediot Achronot is one of the major newspapers in Israel. So it's coming from a very contemporary perspective. And in their introduction, they write as follows. The Sefer HaMesorah Atik Dukei Ta'amim Katuv. So he quotes an ancient, it's not so ancient, I don't know the exact dates. I think it's around the 10th century. This work on the Mesorah, on the tradition of Torah, Dikdukei Ta'amim. It says, Sefer Sheni, Ve'ela Shemot, Hu Sefer Yetziat Mitzrayim, Hu Sefer Habrit. The second book,
The grammar of the.
Excuse me.
Ve'ela Shemot, is the book of the Exodus of Egypt, and it is the book of the covenant. Lefi Heksher Hadvarim, Mashmaut Hadvarim Ha'ila Hisha Chumash Hasheni Mechameshet Kumshei Torah Mechuna Bishlosha Shemot. From the context, it appears that there are actually three names for this book we're about to begin studying. The first name is Eila Shemot, Ve'ela Shemot, and these are the names. Where does that come from?
The beginning of the book.
Mikra.
Okay, those are the first two words of the book, right? So it all opens with Ve'ela Shemot. Sefer Yetziat Mitzrayim, the book of the Exodus from Egypt, and Sefer Habrit, the book of the covenant. We know where the name Exodus from Egypt comes from. The first half of the book talks about the Exodus. Hashem Ashlishi Muvasham B'Tikutei Ta'amim. Sefer Habrit Lakuach Min HaKatuv Vayikach Sefer Habrit Vayikra B'Oznei Ha'am. And the name of the book of the covenant comes from Exodus 24:7, which is source number 2 on the sheet. Moshe took the book of the covenant, or the scroll of the covenant, and he read it aloud to the people. So there is a reference to the book of the covenant. Right, this is at the sort of closes the literary unit describing the giving of the Torah at Har Sinai. So relating to the revelation. Okay, so we have three names, three candidates so far for the name of this book. In source number 3, Nachum Sarna elaborates, and he gives these names. He gives a little bit more of the academic background. Again, these ancient languages don't do much for me, but calling it Ve'ela Shemot, in the second line, follows an ancient and widespread Near East practice of naming a literary work by its initial word or words. In Genesis Rabbah, we find the full title Sefer Eila Shemot. The book of these are the names. The Hebrew name was transliterated in Greek as, someone help me out here, U'elas Smoth. I don't have the Greek letters, so I have no idea what that is.
Alasmot.
All right, thank you. And was used in Latin Bibles in the form of the Hebraica Ve'elas Simoth. Another ancient Hebrew name was Sefer Yetziat Mitzrayim. He quotes again from this book that we quoted above in the Dot Mikra, the book of the departure from Egypt, expressing its central theme. The Jews of Alexandria in pre-Christian times rendered this title in Greek as Exodus Aegyptu, which means the Exodus from Egypt, abbreviated simply as Exodos, which is how it appears in the Septuagint. This was adopted for use in the Old Latin version of the Bible in the form of Exodus, and so passed into the Vulgate and through it into numerous European languages. Another Greek rendering of the Hebrew title was Exagoge, the leading out or the departure from Egypt. The Hellenistic Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria used this name and offered his belief that Moshe himself had designated the Hebrew title behind it. Exagoge must have been quite well known in Egypt, for the Hellenistic Jewish tragedian Ezekiel, who lived at the latest in the mid-1st century BCE, composed a drama by that name. The Hebrew title Sefer Yetziat Mitzrayim was still current in Palestine in the 10th century CE, for it is cited in Dikdukei Ta'amim, the book we quoted earlier by the Masoretic scholar Aaron ben Moshe ben Asher. Still a third Hebrew name for the book is mentioned in the Talmud, Sota Chomesh Sheni, the second fifth of the Torah. Okay, so we have some many options or many early candidates for what this book was called.
Look at fractions.
Right, so but it seems to break into right. So one strategy in naming the book is let's identify the major theme of the book and name it after that. And everyone seems to agree that the major theme is Exodus, although we raise a big question. If the major theme is Exodus, well, that's only the first third really of the book. What about the rest of it? So we do have one position that named it Sefer HaBrit, the Book of the Covenant, which might relate more to the revelation at Sinai. Again, not the bulk of the material. Gary's correct that really the second half is dominated by the description of the Mishkan. But certainly the revelation at Sinai plays a central role. And takes up, it's about 5 to 6, depending how we count, about 5 chapters or so. Or then there's a second strategy, which is let's just find the easiest way to identify it. So either we'll identify it by the first words, right? And that gets, I guess, eventually shortened from Ve'ela Shemot to Ela Shemot, because it doesn't make sense to begin the name of a book with and. So they drop the vav. That seemed to be one move. From Ve'ela Shemot, which is how it actually begins, to Ela Shemot. And Ela Shemot gets further shortened to Shemot, as we know it. And then there was another strategy which says, let's just call it the second book. The second book, right?
Who's naming the book?
Who's naming it? That's a great question.
The author usually names it. And since the
author-
Rabbanu Shalom is the author,
Yeah,
and since if you look at a Sefer Torah, there is no title. There are no
Right.
subtitles. We
There's
don't
no-
have that.
we don't
And it's
have that.
interesting. If a human were writing the Sefer Torah, we're creating a book, it would not be impossible for that person to come up with ideas. I'll call this book whatever. I will give chapter names. I will give paragraph names and so on. We don't have that. What we do have are texts which are provided in specific spacing, very carefully. We have it with spacing between sections, which becomes significant as to what those breaks mean. That's interesting. It's the readers who are trying to name the book in order so that we can grasp it and understand it and play with it,
Yeah.
or learn from it more effectively.
Yeah. So, anyone have any other suggestions for what we might name this book?
I really like what the Rebbe does with it, with this idea of names, because through the events in the book, each Jew really becomes, they really receive their name in a different sense, their essential national and personal identities as Jews, and that we have the change from the word Hebrews into Israel in this book, which is really good. I mean, that's just I'm just adding that one in, but I thought that's a way of summarizing that.
Yeah, beautiful. We'll come back to that. That's a beautiful insight, and we'll come back to that a bit later. So let's go a little further, because we have some other midrashim that identify perhaps some few other ways of thinking about the book. So the first comes from Breshit Rabbah, and it's commenting on Sefer Breshit in the story of creation. And it says that within the story of the creation, 5 times it says the word or ora, light. And it says that each of those 5 lights correspond to one of the 5 chumashim in Torah. Vayom Elohim yehi or, can I get Sefer Breshit? So the first is corresponding to Breshit. Shabo nitasak HaKadosh Baruch Hu bara et olamo, in which God created the world. By he or, this is most important for us. So let me scroll down to the English for you. Vahi or Keneged Sefer Ve'ela Shemot. So here it's called Sefer Ve'ela Shemot. And why is it called, what's the main theme according to this? Shabo Yatsu Yisrael Me'afela Le'ora, which they left from darkness into light. Right, so not only putting it in the context of the Exodus, but also, right, each Chumash, each of the 5 books of Chumash are their own independent sefer, but they have to fit somehow together into the comprehensive unit that we call Torah. So informing it by what appears in Sefer Breshit is important in that context also. Vayar Elohim et ha'or ki tov keneged Sefer Vayikra shehu malei halachot rabot. So the light was good corresponds to Vayikra, which is full of many halachot, the implication being that halachot and laws are good. Vayavdel Elokim ben or ben choshech keneged Sefer Bamidbar shehu mavdil ben Yosem Mitzrayim le'lei ha'aretz. He separated between the light and the darkness, corresponds to Sefer Bamidbar, in which God separates the generation that left Egypt from those who entered into the land. Vayikra Elokim la'or yom keneged Sefer Mishnah Torah, Shehu Malei Halachot Rabot, and God called the light day, corresponds to Sefer Mishnah Torah, which is another word, right, which is the Hebrew equivalent of Deuteronomy, which we call Sefer Devarim, which is also full of many halachot. And then they ask, well, you said that was the same reason for Vayikra. Okay, so there's halachot in Vayikra and in Devarim. So interesting, right, that also reminds us that whatever we're going to name it, and the name should fit into the Torah as a whole. But it has to be one comprehensive work comprised of many independent books. So that's an interesting piece there. Then finally, in the Otzar Midrashim, source number 5, it tells us what the key lesson or the key merit of learning each of the 5 Chumashim is. You learn, if you study Sefer Breshit, teach it to your children, then it's considered as if you were involved in creating the world. Sefer Eila Shemot, the Vav is dropped here. Ilu Amad al Har Sinai. You study Sefer Eila Shemot, it's as if you stood at Har Sinai. So the central theme, central event for this midrash is the revelation at Sinai and not the Exodus. If you study Sefer Vayikra, it's as if you offered the sacrifices. Interesting, the 4th book is called here Vayidaber. Right? We call it Bamidbar, right? Or Numbers. Vayidaber is literally just the first word, and he spoke, and that doesn't seem interesting if there's any themes that could be developed for that name of the book. It's as if you journeyed with the Israelites in the desert. If you study Sefer Eila HaDevarim, it's as if you studied the entire Torah. Okay, so the key theme in this source is the key events, the key theme of Sefer Shemot, or the second Sefer, we won't call it Sefer Shemot yet, is the event, the revelation at Sinai, and not the Exodus. Yeah, was that a question?
I was saying this seems almost overly generous.
How so?
I mean, teaching your children Chumash is fine, but it doesn't relate with the creation of the world.
Okay, so yeah, you could do a lot with this, right? I'm not sure. When it comes to the korbanot, we certainly have a principle that says, given that we're not able to offer sacrifices, then if studying sacrifices is a merit as if we've offered the sacrifices, right? I'm not sure we can take this literally to the other descriptions in this medrash to say that you've created the world. Certainly, al pi drush, you create a world every time you learn Torah and every time you teach Torah to your children. That certainly is creating a metaphoric, a symbolic world. But you're right, it does seem to be a little bit extreme and a little bit, as you said, generous. But anyway, the point of this one was to show that in this midrash, the key event is the revelation and not the Exodus. Let's move on to source number
One,
6.
one second. What
Yeah.
is Arakim?
Huh?
What is Arakim?
Arachim. We have a tractate in the Talmud called Arachim, and in the end of Sefer Vayikra, the Torah talks about Arachim, which is literally values. It means like the monetary value for different people. It's again one of those things that doesn't fit so nicely with our modern day sensibilities. But right, what's the monetary value if you injure a servant? What's the monetary value if you defame someone? You know, all sorts of laws of damages to an individual and how they're evaluated.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Source number 6, the Ramban. So remember, we've identified a few different ways that this book might be named. One approach is to what's the most easily identifying characteristic of the book, either the opening words, or the most distinctive opening word, or just identifying it as the second book. And then there's others that approach it by themes. And so the themes that seem to get expressed most often are either the theme of Exodus or the theme of Revelation at Sinai. With that in mind, let's look at the Ramban. We'll start in the second paragraph. And you'll tell me when I need to scroll down in the English. Mityacheid Sefer ve'ela Shemot ve'inyan hagalut harishon hanigzar beperush uvegeula mimenu. So Sefer ve'ela Shemot is unique or set apart, is distinct for dealing with the exile, the galut, the diaspora, the first diaspora, and the redemption from it. Velachin chazar v'yitchil b'shemot yordei Mitzrayim u'misparam af al pi shekvar nichtav zeh ba'avor.
Can you scroll down?
Sorry, yes. Ureshita galut kime'az hucha. And that's why at the very beginning of the book, it repeats the same names and the same basic counts of the 70 people that we encountered at the end of Sefer Bereshit. Even though it was already written once, because their descendant down to Egypt was the beginning of this exile, of this diaspora. V'hine hagalut inenu nishlam ad yom shuvam el mikomam ve'el ma'alat avotam yashuvu. What is the point of redemption from the first exile? So according to the Ramban, it's when we return to the place of their ancestors and to the spiritual level of their ancestors. U'cheyatsumi Mitzrayim, af al pi sheyatsumi beit avadim, adayin yechshavu golim, kayu ba'aretz lo lahem nivuchim b'midbar. When they left Egypt, even though they left the house of slavery, they're still in exile, still in diaspora, because they're in a land which is not them, walking around aimlessly in the desert. Uchsheba'u el har Sinai v'asu hamishkan, v'shav HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'yishra shchinato b'neihem, az shavu emalat avotam, shayat sod eloka alei oholehem. When they came to Mount Sinai and made the Mishkan, and God returned his divine presence among them, then they returned to the spiritual level of their ancestors, because God was now with them. And that's why the book concludes with the construction of the Mishkan and God's continued presence amongst them. What crucial question is the Ramban answering here?
What is unique about the book of the second book in the Torah as compared with anything else? Because one could say that a lot of what is in divine is a repetition, of course, of other things, and halachas closely related to things already given. And one could say that what's in Vayikra is related to some of the things that already have been introduced in the second book of the Torah, and Bamidbar is I don't know, I would say that is has some uniqueness about it too, but anyway. he's
Okay,
trying to-
so remember, we asked a question. If we're going to identify the book by a major theme or by a major
More so than
event,
even in the Exodus.
so it
Right,
seems that the themes that have been identified don't account for the entirety of the book. If we're going to call it Exodus, or the Exodus from Egypt, so that only brings us through chapter 15 or 16. If we're going to call it after the revelation at Sinai, so we can liberally give that 18 to 24, chapters 18 to 24, right? And then we have the Mishkan, which was never suggested as a name or the key theme for the book, but that would be from 24 to the end. Again, I forget how many chapters. I don't have a comment right in front of me. So we don't have, if we're going to be naming our books thematically, we don't seem to have one theme that covers the entire book.
This seems to say the redemption is the
Ah.
most important
It
thing.
says there is a theme that explains the entire book. What is that theme?
The
It's not a
redemption.
name that we have, it's a theme of redemption.
Mm-hmm.
So he would therefore say, because he did identify it earlier in his comments as Sefer Ve'ela Shemot, the book of Ve'ela Shemot, but he would say that it's really the theme of redemption. I mean, he doesn't offer that as a name, right? We could have very well said that maybe this should have been divided into 3 different books, right? But so he says that there has to be one unifying theme. And that unifying theme is the theme of redemption. He doesn't answer the question, but he says that full redemption will require returning to the original place as well. We get the Mishkans, we reach a spiritual height, but we don't return to Eretz Yisrael by the end of Sefer Shemot, although one could argue that was the plan. The plan was that by the end of Sefer Shemot, we should be poised and ready to enter into Eretz Yisrael. It's only when they screw up, right? Vayikra is just an further elaboration of the laws. There's not really any time passage of significance between the end of Sefer Shemot and the end of Sefer Vayikra. And then in Sefer Bamidbar, when the spies go, that's when we're destined to stay in punished to stay in the desert longer. But really, we were posed to enter into the land at the end of Shemot. So it kind of works for the Ramban. Okay, so interestingly, though, no one calls it the Book of Redemption, which is what he seems to be suggesting it should be called Sefer Geula, maybe the Book of Redemption. But it's a really interesting comment, and he finds a unifying theme. Okay. Any other questions at this point?
I was just thinking that I think he used the word exile, didn't he? Quite a few times. And he's really looking at things in those terms.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exile and redemption.
And
Yeah,
not only redemption, but also the state of exile.
right.
And the Mishkan comes in there because, after all, the building of the Mishkan is to bring about the end of the exile of the Shekhinah, which that is that actual ability to feel the presence of Hashem in a very tangible way, you call that kind of experience. That has been gradually coming back in this great gift that Moshe gave us. But we certainly don't, even though we are required to pray every day and we are required to make some kind of sacrifice of ourselves every day in our animal souls or something, whatever it is. Still, and people say even people today living in Eretz Israel still feel like they're in exile.
Right.
So,
Right.
so there's that whole theme as well.
I would also add to the Ramban that if the theme is redemption, as he seems to be implying strongly, so then we have 2 types of redemption, and this is I think it was Isaiah Berlin who writes about this, and then it's quoted by all sorts of contemporary Jewish thinkers, right? Freedom from or freedom to. So by calling the book of Exodus, we're talking about freedom from the Egyptian slavery and oppression. But by bringing in and including in that redemption arc, giving of the Torah, we're also then including freedom to worship God, freedom to serve and to follow the laws. It's not just to not have an oppressor over us, but to have a real mission and directive as far as what we're supposed to be doing with our lives and with ourselves. So
I think
that's another.
I think there's sometimes a problem of trying to connect the physical things, the actions and so on, with the thoughts and the connection with the Shem and all that. And this seems to talk about the difference about how our minds and our activity can be not so tied to the actual physical events.
Yeah, and we need to be sure that we're including both. Okay, so let's see Rashi. Rashi is quote, I'm taken for given that we're all familiar with the opening of the book, but let's look at those opening psukim, source number 7. These are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. Each man came with his home, with his family. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, Zvulun, Binyamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. Vayikol nefesh yotzei yerech Yaakov shivim nefesh. Yosef hayab b'Mitzrayim. So the total count of those who came with Yaakov was 70, and Joseph was in Egypt. Right? We've all seen trying to work out exactly how we get to 70. Yosef and his children seem to be included in that count. Vayamat Yosef b'chol echav b'chol ador hahu. Joseph and all his brothers in that entire generation died out. B'nei Yisrael paru vayishvetzu vayirbu v'yatzmu b'mod me'od. And the children of Israel were fruitful and multiplied and increased very greatly so that the land was filled with them. And that's how the book opens. Rashi comments, source number 9. Eila Shemot. These are the names. Afal pi shemena'an b'chayehem b'shmotam, chazor mena'am b'mitatam. Odiya chibatam shenim shalu lekochavim. Even though God counted them, they were counted already when they were living. Right? That's source number 8. In Sefer Breshit, we have a list of the people who came down to Egypt with Jacob. So why is it repeated at the beginning of Shemot? So Rashi says that they're counted again in their death in order to let us know how much they were loved. Shnim shalu lekochavim, because they're compared to the stars. Shemotziamu machnisam b'mispar uvi shmotam, because God takes, right, in the evening, he lets the stars emerge with their number and with their name. Shene'emar hamotzi b'mispar tziva'am l'chulam b'shem yikraz. It says in Isaiah, he brings out their host by number. He calls them all by name. Okay, so we have the fact that God again names those who came down with Yaakov once they're after they've died. A second time is a sign of love compared to the stars. So in Shul this past week, I spoke about Rabbi David Foreman's approach to Sefer Parshat Vayechi. And this also is very heavily informed, this piece is informed by Rabbi Foreman. He says that this image of the stars correlating to the numbers of Bnei Israel should sound familiar to us.
Yeah.
What does it bring us back to?
The promise to Avram.
Promise to Abraham in Sefer, in source number 11 in Sefer Breshit. Right? What does God say to Abraham? Sorry, Jeff, you were right, to Avram, before his name is changed.
Right.
God gives Avram a promise and says, I will protect you, your reward is great. Vayomer Avram, Hashem Elokim, Mati ten li va'anochi olech ariri uven meshek deipeti u'demeshek Eliezer. Avram says, what am I going to inherit? What am I going to get? I have no one, no children. All I have is my servant. Vayomer Avram, Hin li lo natata zera v'nei ben beiti yoreshoti. V'nei dvar Hashem elav lemor. Lo yishrach hazeh ki im asher yitzei me'echa hu yirashecha. God says, your servant will not be the one to inherit from you, but your own flesh and blood, your own child will. Vayotzi oto akutza vayomer habetna hashamayma uspor kochavim im tuchal uspor otam vayomer lo ko yeh zaracha. God takes him out and he says, look to the skies and count the stars. If you can count the stars, that's how great your descendants will be. Okay, so it's very deliberate that Rashi is quoting this pasuk from Yeshayahu, this midrash, which brings us back to Abraham. Rabbi Foreman says, I'm not going to look at everything, but I have excerpts in source number 12 from his introduction to his book on Sefer Shemot. He says that in Sefer Shemot, we've come to a key moment. What's the key moment? And you alluded to this a little bit. B'nai Yisrael paru vayishretzu vayirbu me'od me'od. There's a population explosion among B'nai Yisrael. Okay?
Mhm.
So we've come to the point where God's promise to Abraham is being fulfilled, where he is becoming this great nation. What does God say to him? What's God's promise at this point? God's promise is, I am going to count each and every one of you. The exact opposite of what God told Abraham. God told Abraham, you're going to become so great and so numerous, it will be impossible to count your descendants.
Impossible for mortals, maybe not for God.
Okay, so yes, of course, impossible for mortals, not impossible for God. But there's this great irony going on here, right? On the one hand, is that God is giving us, right? God is giving assurance that actually the very opposite of what we thought is going to take place. And why would we need that assurance at this point?
Self-importance.
Mhm. Mhm.
Unmute me.
You're muted.
Okay, because things are looking pretty dire, and the Egyptians are trying their best to not just decimate, completely annihilate the Jewish people by killing all the males.
Okay, so even before that, right? Remember, we're at the very beginning, before any
Very
decrees
beginning.
come out.
Ah.
But what's the fear? You come down
That-
to Egypt, you settle with 70 people, you're a well-established family, and all of a sudden, population explosion, right? So if you take the Midrashim seriously, they're replicating at 10-fold, 100-fold, whatever it is. What's the fear?
They'll assimilate.
Yeah,
Well, not that we'll assimilate.
that will take over Egypt
Yeah, maybe that will take over Egypt. That certainly was Paro's fear.
and stay there.
Maybe they'll like it there and they'll stay. But there's a fear for B'nai Yisrael as well. There's a fear that here we came down, a small, tight-knit, close community, and now I can't keep track of anyone, right? It's we become too big for our own good, perhaps. So Hashem gives assurance, even though you have grown to this great nation, I still care and keep track of each of you as individuals, right? That even though it might seem like your numbers are too great and too big for yourselves, for me, it's not a problem.
You missed it.
And so that's kind of a reassurance that that Hashem is offering according to this midrashic interpretation brought by Rashi. Okay, and then Rabbi Foreman continues, and he says, if we think about the name of Sefer Breshit for a second, what does the name Sefer Breshit, how do we translate it?
Genesis beginnings.
Genesis, the beginnings. So that, of course, is referring to the creation of the world,
Right.
Genesis of the world. But there's another creation, there's another Genesis that takes place over the course of that book, which is the Genesis and the creation of the Jewish people.
Right.
Right? Maybe not to the point of being an established nation. That only happens at the beginning of Sefer Shemot. But certainly we have a development of this family, of this people that will become what we know as the Jewish people, as B'nai Yisrael. Rabbi Foreman says, I'm at the top, I don't have page numbers, the second page with the Rabbi Foreman sheets. Kind of just as there is more than one reason to call Genesis, Genesis, there is also more than one reason to call Shemot names. Which is to say, just as in Genesis, there was an overt moment of creation at the beginning of the book, but a larger, more subtle process of creation would unfold that would span the whole book, the creation of the family of Israel, more deeply justifying the name Genesis. So it is with the book of names. The people are overtly named by God in just a verse or two at the beginning of the book. But the book is called names for a reason that pervades the book as a whole. It's as if the name of the book were saying, God continues to know our names, to keep track of each and every one throughout all the events that happen in the book. Okay, so this idea of names, of God caring and keeping track of us as individuals is really crucial to the book, right? As Rena says, as things get bad, as oppression and all these horrible edicts are placed against the Jewish people, so certainly then it's a source of comfort to know that God cares about us and still has that level of attention, of concern for each individual. And as, you know, after we emerge, right, as we're developing as a nation, that each and every individual in the nation counts and is of significance also is a comforting message. I think we can take this a step further, because in the next section, I want to point to where we see the idea of names throughout the book of Shemot. Not only the names of the Jewish people, but what's another key theme? Right, when God appears to Moshe in our parsha at the burning
He
bush,
said, what do I call you?
right? Moshe says, great, you just appeared to me. I believe it's, you know, I believe you. But source number 13,
What name
What
shall
do they name you? What do they
right?
want?
Kine anochi ba'el b'nei Yisrael v'amarti lahem elokei
Yeah,
avotechem
sure,
shlachani aleichem v'amru li ma shmo.
Beautiful.
Yeah,
Right? They're going to say, what's his name? How do we know? How do we
Right.
believe you? What's the name of this God that appeared to you?
right.
Right? And then again in source number 14 at the beginning of Parshat Vayera, right? Avera Elokim el Moshe vayomer elav ani Hashem va'era el Avraham el Yitzchak el Yaakov ve'el Shaddai Yishmi Hashem lo nodatu lachem. Right? I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai. We've spoken about this on many occasions. But my name Hashem was not known to them. So part of the book of Shemot is coming to know God in God's name as Hashem, as Yud-Kei Vav-Kei.
The
Right?
name.
And it's not only for the Jewish people, but that's one of the major goals of the unfolding of the Malkut and the punishment against Egypt, is that so Paro and the Egyptians in the whole world should know of God as well.
Mm.
And it continues later in the book,
Mhm.
right? So after the Chet HaEgel, after the sin of the golden calf, when Moshe is begging God for forgiveness, we get to the point of forgiveness, and we have this really intimate moment between Moshe and Hashem, chapter 33. I'll read the English and I'll read the Hebrew. Vayomer Hashem al Moshe, gam et hadavar hazeh asher dibarta eseh ki matzat chen beinai ve'edacha b'shem. Right, that which you requested from me, I will do. I'll pardon them, because you found favor in my eye. Ve'edacha b'shem, and I know you, singled you out by name. Right, so this idea of God continuing to identify with the names and call people out by their names. Vayomer hareini na kodecha. So Moshe says back, show me your glory. Vayomer ani avir kol tovi al panecha v'karati b'shem Hashem lefanecha. God says, I will pass before you and spread all my glory. I will call in the name of Hashem before you. I'll have favor on those who have favor and compassion on those who I have compassion. But you can't see my face, for no one can see my face and live. Okay, so we have this moment of revelation. And what is the revelation that God gives him?
The name, the whole
The name of God.
special name.
We can continue it further. I didn't bring the psukim, and I apologize. But right, if we think about the Mishkan, so what's the key figure in the Mishkan, of course, is the Kohen Gadol. And what does the Kohen Gadol have? What does he wear?
The tzitz that says Kadosh
Kodesh
Lashem.
Lashem. But what else?
And the pomegranates on this.
Yeah.
Yes,
on the
both.
end.
But he carries the names of the tribes.
Tribes, yeah, they were
In Israel, right? So this idea of names figures prominently, right? It actually is a unifying theme throughout the book. It's not just easily, let's identify the first word that people recognize and say, oh, that's the second book, but it actually is a central theme of Sefer Shemot. It's a theme as far as God's, right, allaying some of the fears that we might have as we develop from small, close-knit family into large nation. And it's a theme as far as our relationship to God and how we can relate to Hashem by identifying Hashem's name, right? And recognizing and knowing God's name. Right, with along these lines, and I think this comes back to what you were quoting from the Rebbe before. We have a very provocative midrash, which I'm sure will be familiar to some of us. The midrash in several places tells us, in the name of Rav Huna b'Shem Bar Kapara, source number 16, Bishvil Arba Dvarim Yigalu Yisam Mitzrayim. There are four things that the Jews merit, in which the Jews merited redemption from Egypt. Shalosh Shinu et Shmam ve'et Leshonam. What are the four things that were the only things that allowed us to be redeemed from Egypt? Number one, Lo Shinu et Shmam. They didn't change their names. They kept their Jewish names. Ve'et Leshonam. They kept their language. Lo Amru Lashon Hara. They didn't speak Lashon Hara. They didn't speak badly about each other. V'lo Nisa B'neihem Echad Mehem Parutz Be'erva. They kept their sexual morality. Okay, so keeping their names.
Their clothing.
There's other versions that say clothing. You're right.
Clothing, yeah.
Yeah.
But because slaves really in the pictures and things from Egypt are not really wearing clothing.
Right. So anyway, but keeping their names is one of the key of survival. And so, Anne, I think what you were getting at from the Rebbe is that part of names is connecting with who you really are, connecting with your essence, right?
Of course.
So throughout the Sefer, right, part of it, part of the bigger challenge it calls out to us is, okay, we're part of this nation, we're part of this Jewish people. What does that mean? What does that mean for us as individuals? What does it mean for us as a community? How can we be sure to be true to who we really are? And that perhaps is another reason for the name Shemot having been, won the day, as it were, at least as far as naming in the Hebrew sense. And with this in mind, I just wanted to close with one very powerful passage. So a couple weeks ago, I shared that I just finished reading The Tattooist of Auschwitz, which was a very powerful book. But there's one amazing scene in this book. So I don't know if you're familiar with the story or not. It tells the story of the Tattooist of Auschwitz. And it's really a love story, right? He has this romantic connection he forms with one of the female Jews that he tattooed, and sees her, he falls in love with her. They're able to have a relationship during their time in Auschwitz, and part of it is because he's struggling with the fact that as a tattooist he's seen as kind of working for the enemy, and a lot of the Jews in the camp don't like him, and the woman that he falls in love with, Gitta, also is working for the SS and the administrative offices of Auschwitz. So there's this really remarkable scene where part of the better treatment that he gets is he had his own bedroom in the barracks, and he was not housed with the other Jews, he was housed with the gypsies. It was seen as a better accommodations. But one day they took all the gypsies away and killed them all. And so this was the moment that really broke him. He had formed real friendships and saw the gypsies living with him as really being his family. And so as he's mourning their death, we have this moment where Gitta, his girlfriend, becomes his wife, doesn't know how to break the spell of, I don't know how the name's pronounced, Lal's grief. They have both withstood for more than 2.5 years the worst of humanity. This is the first time she's seen him sink to this depth of depression. What about the thousands of our people, she yells at him one day. What about what you have seen at Auschwitz with Mengele? Do you know how many people have been through these two camps? Do you? Layla does not reply. That should be, I see the cards with the names and ages. Babies, grandparents. I see their names and their numbers. I can't even count that high. She's working in the office, processing all the prisoners, all those who come into the camp. So she's the one who's connecting the numbers that he's putting on their arms with their identity for the Nazi records. She knows their names. Layla doesn't need Gitta to remind him of the number of people who have passed through the camp. He has marked their skin himself. He looks at her, she is studying the ground. He realizes that while to him they were just numbers, to Gitta they were names. Her job means that she knows more about these people than he does. She knows their names and ages, and he realizes that this knowledge will forever haunt her. I'm sorry, you're right, he says. Any death is one too many. I'll try not to be so gloomy. Okay, so just a very powerful passage about, right, he's the one who has physical contact with all these people, and yet it's this realization that only by knowing their name, only by knowing that piece about them, that one can really feel any sort of connection or identification with them, which I thought was a powerful passage, and I think ties in strongly to what we're saying about Shemot. So as we begin the Eila Shemot, the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus, Sefer HaBrit, whatever name we decide should be the appropriate name, certainly this idea of the names, of finding, like connecting with who our true name is, connecting with Shem Hashem, with Hashem as was revealed in Egypt and in the Mishkan and Har Sinai, is something that hopefully as we begin our studies of this Sefer, we'll be able to tie into that and connect with it. Any final thoughts or questions?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, please.
About 10, 12 years ago, when we had women's tefillah on, it was usually on the Shabbos closest to Rosh Chodesh, I did Bar Torah on exactly this subject. And there was a whole lot of new stuff that I learned tonight and a bunch of stuff that I put in my Bar Torah, but there were three things that I had found different rabbis commenting on that I added that weren't here. The first is that when you call somebody's name, you're trying to grab their attention. Pay attention, something important is, I need your attention, something important is going to happen. That's the first thing. The second thing is that a shame is also a reputation.
Right.
And basically the reputation of Bnei Israel and the enemies, the Sonei Israel, is set in, this is the prototype, it's set for generations by what happens here in Shemot, somewhere in Sefer Shemot. And the third comes from, I thought this was really terrific. And the third was, I'm going to read it because it was really good. Torah of Mojits, pronounce that, Robert. Mojits.
Yeah.
The divine Divrei Torah translated by Reb Eliezer Weger, a Mojitzer Chassid from Rehovot. The primary purpose of the Egyptian exile was to prepare us in some way for receiving the Torah, to build up our credits, so to speak, by helping us earn the right and the privilege to finally reach Mount Sinai. The Torah is also referred to as the name of Hashem, like you said, as well as the often mentioned idea that the entire Torah is in fact composed of a multitude of various names of Hashem in different formats. This starts to shed some light on our question, the Eila Shemot, for the names in fact refer to the Torah itself. They went down to Egypt because of the Torah as preparation to receive it. It's all in the name and for the sake of Hashem's name, which means the name anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I thought that was great, and it's not for me.
Okay. Yeah, Shakar. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Rabbi, could you talk about the people, the changing of a name of somebody who's very ill or something? I don't understand that.
Yeah. So the idea behind that is it's a way of changing someone's destiny, fate. So right when Hashem changes Abraham's name, right, it was with the promise of children. So Rashi quotes the Gemara that says Avram would not have children. Abraham will have children. So it's the same idea that if God forbid someone is dangerously ill, we might say, well, it's Chaim, Moshe that's sick, but Chaim Moshe has a different fate, has a different destiny. So that's the idea of it. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for everyone's input here. Next week, we are on vacation, so we're not going to have Shir next week. We will resume in 2 weeks and looking forward to our continued studies of Sefer Shemot together.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, have a good night,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Have a great vacation.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
You, Rena. Whoa.